Hey guys, this is the video that goes with the Q&A on designing a cockpit. And I'm just going to start with the thumbnails and then go all the way through it. So, since this is a spaceship, and I'm kind of assuming already that I'm probably going to have space as the background, I'm starting with a black background, and then I am just building on top of it with shapes in like a light medium gray color. Seeing how I like the shapes, seeing how it feels, and then trying to get, at least like 20 of these out before I make any decision about what I actually want the cockpit to look like, because I'm not totally sure at this point. I also like to keep certain kinds of like main shapes, like say those canopy arcs, which I'm assuming are going to be part of the canopy at this point. I like to keep that stuff on a separate layer, so that as I'm thumbnailing, every time I need a canopy shape like that, I can just turn that layer on and then add more. Again, just as a way of trying to speed things up, so that I can get quite a few of these out before I start getting married to any decisions. As far as making sure that the Star Wars cockpit feels like a Star Wars cockpit, the main things that I guess would set Star Wars apart from other IPs and stuff visually, which again, even nowadays, because Star Wars is such a popular movie, and the series has so many, not really imitators, but it's inspired so many different things at this point that the Star Wars aesthetic has become a lot of different kinds of aesthetics, and the thing that used to define it, which would be the sort of the lived-in universe look, and having things not, again, it's the idea that it's not the future, it's a different place entirely, so it's kind of a weird mix of technologically advanced and things that look like they would be right out of our time period. And for example, with the ship, normally, like if you look inside the cockpit of an F-16 or a more modern jet fighter, the amount of instruments inside is staggering. Like every square inch in a lot of them, every square inch of the main console on the sides is just instruments. And it's just tons and tons of these little instruments. And while, I would imagine that they're all useful and they have all these things that are signified by having this stuff around because they're not spaceships. And I guess I'm making an assumption for Star Wars right here, but I assume that because they're spaceships and you've got astromech droids and stuff, explanation one for why they really don't have that many instruments in them. And then two, I think, and this is with Star Wars stuff in general, I think it just looks nicer. And Star Wars, in a lot of ways, is not form over function, but, well, yeah, okay. So Star Wars is form over function in a lot of ways, and how something looks, because, and this works with a lot of sci-fi, how something looks will then take precedence over, you know, being designed initially for trying to be something that would actually work. So with a lot of stuff, a lot of times you design for what feels best, and then you come up with the explanation afterwards. And as far as I can tell, I mean, a lot of the, and also, I mean, it's an old movie and it's budget stuff, but I mean, the consoles on a lot of the old jet fighters, on the old starfighters, they're really basic. Like, you know, a smattering of buttons, usually like 2 or 3 screens, usually like 2, not even 3. They tend not to break the silhouette too much, like it's just a really straightforward bunch of rectangles and buttons, and then usually they'll have some pipes, some like dirty pipes winding around, and a few different things like that. Although actually, it's worth pointing out too that I'm talking about the original trilogy. The prequels actually do look a little bit more advanced. Like the inside of the Jedi Starfighter has displays that look more like something you would see now. But obviously being made in the 70s, when you look at the original Star Wars, I mean, they'll have readouts that you would find on like an old Apple computer. So trying to get Star Wars to feel right usually involves trying to design a future that would have been created in the past. So you want to you want to hint at complexity and, you know, advanced technology, but then you can't, as far as what we would consider advanced technology right now, you can't actually do that. Like you couldn't use well, no, you couldn't. No. But also you couldn't use like a digital monitor inside most ships that have like a really nice HD display, or you can talk back and forth with people, because it would look weird compared to the X-Wings and the Y-Wings and the B-Wings and all the stuff that were designed in the 70s and the early 80s that just have, like, you know, these funny little 3D wire readouts. And when you talk to somebody, you just get this funny little kind of scanny, crackly picture. Because, you know, in the 70s they didn't... I mean, you could assume somebody knew, but they were not preparing for how complex computer graphics were going to get, for one, I guess. And then B, because you want the computer screens to all stand out as computer screens. You don't, you know... I guess you want them to have a specific look that is technical, and the best way to pull that off is to just make things look like they are a radar from the 80s. And just like with anything else, I mean, when you're designing one of these, you know, I mean, you're considering it's all the normal stuff you would consider while designing a person or a costume or an environment or anything, where I'm trying to create balance between the monitors and the buttons and the canopy shapes, and I'm also trying to create something that A, looks pleasing, and B, kind of strikes that balance between futuristic starfighter setup and the 80s. Kind of angular, hard shapes, and, usually lots of wires. Things tend to look kind of dirty. Color-wise, too, you'll notice that I start with less color, and then I will kind of build into too much color, and then take it back to, theoretically, a nice, happy medium. But especially in the case of the Starfighter, I try to leave color out until I get, a thumbnail that I really like, and then I start figuring out the colors. But up until that, it's all grayscale, and then as I am working on the monitors and the buttons and everything for the inside of the cockpit, I'm going to keep the colors on most of them the same. And I think orange for the buttons, like a reddish orange, and then orange for the monitors. But I start off with them all very similar in color, and then as I get further in, I'll try, you know, experimenting with blues and purples and yellows and greens and all this different stuff. And then usually what happens is I will do that for like an hour, and after a while it will start to, parts will stand out to me that seem like they're too much, and then I start kind of trimming away at those and then going back and forth in this process of trying to figure out, alright, well what could I do here, trying it, and then figuring out whether or not I feel like that works. But those decisions are something I don't like to do until I'm getting to the end of the image, because it would just take too long trying to figure out your color scheme, I think, or at least for me. It would take me too long if I was constantly messing around with the colors of the buttons and the monitors throughout the painting. And so I just kind of push it towards the end, and then I will tackle all that at once. Again, too, as far as designing the monitors and stuff is concerned, at this point, I mean, I kind of know that I probably want somewhere between 2 and 5 monitors somewhere, but I'm not even thinking too much about what they're for or what they do. At this point, I'm just thinking about what shapes would look nice inside the cockpit, and where would it help to have little light sources to kind of create a rhythm and move your eye around. But as I'm putting these shapes down, I mean, I don't, with the exception, okay, the middle one we can assume is going to be the main readout. But other than that, I'm not thinking at all about what any of those do. Also, I think it helps to have if you're doing a cockpit that has monitors and stuff like that. It helps to have them break the silhouette of the main console in well, I was going to say in starfighters, but even in real jet crafts, the head-up display and a few other things, usually they break that main shape. But the sci-fi stuff, I mean, I think it helps if you have instruments that are kind of turned at slightly funny angles, and that you have things breaking the silhouette just to make it feel like there's a lot going on. Like with any image, too, you want something like a focal point with this. I mean, obviously, it's not. It's a little bit different, but basically, it helps to keep the most interesting parts still towards the center console. I like to have lights and monitors and things like that that are used to balance things out and to create rhythm that show around the sides. But anything that's really dominant, like obviously the large monitors and stuff like that, it helps to have them, assuming you're doing a cockpit again, kind of front and center, so that you don't have a ton of, because light is a huge focal point. Anytime you have a monitor or anything that glows, it immediately becomes a focus. And so you don't want to have anything like that that is kind of far off to the side in some funny spot where it's going to be distracting the whole time. Oh, that's another thing worth mentioning, as I'm doing it in the video. So a lot of times with thumbnails, because I know some people put their perspective grid at the beginning, but when I'm doing this kind of stuff for a thumbnail, usually I will do the perspective roughly out of my head for the first like 10% of it, and just kind of be feeling out where I would like things to go, so that I don't set up my perspective and then when I start to draw things in, feel like it wasn't interesting enough or it wasn't severe enough. So I will, and this is not just for cockpits, but for anything, I will start the image without perspective, and then as I start to figure out where all the shapes are and what I like about it and what they're doing, I then will figure out the perspective for the whole piece and then kind of match it all. again, it helps to have a few exposed wires, tubes and stuff kind of running around to make it feel more Star Wars. In a lot of ways, I mean, you might assume that a society that has the technology to make starfighters would have the technology to kind of hide their wires, but that would be less interesting. Also, when you're designing stuff in general, um, you kind of want the shapes to go along with whatever the theme of the image is, or the theme of the thing you're designing. And so, for the starship, you kind of want to take into consideration what would be the main qualities of that starship. Like, is it fast? Is it rugged? Is it strong? Is it kind of falling apart? Well, everything I've just said describes the Millennium Falcon. But is it? What's the main character of it? And then, how can you design the shapes to kind of reinforce that idea? So let's say it was a racing ship. If it was a racing ship, then it's probably going to be really long, and it's going to have lots of stripes that kind of move towards the front to give that feeling of motion. This is meant to be sort of a mix in between something that looks like it is fast and something that looks like it is versatile. You may notice I use the polygonal lasso a lot while working on this. Um, I think, in general, a lot of times if I'm working on something that's man-made, I will try to freehand as little as possible. Um, Mostly just because those sharp edges, and when I say sharp edges, I don't literally mean like, so keep the edges sharp the whole time, although that ends up happening a lot with this stuff. Um, I specifically mean like the angles that things are moving at, and the edges are usually kind of rigid, and that is what makes them feel, like they were produced in a factory and not grown organically. So another funny thing with Star Wars stuff is basically trying to decide on the ratio between how much you want something to look like it's from this world and how much you don't. And the radar frames are a good kind of example of that in this one because... Oh, sorry. It's late. On one hand, you know, I mean, you want things to feel like they were developed on their own and not, you know, at Lockheed Martin or something in California. Thank you. And so, what ends up happening is you, or at least I end up coming to this decision whenever I'm designing electronics or something, where, so on one hand, we know that that is a radar display to some extent. In the middle of the console, we have radar displays. They have buttons around them that you use, you know, when you're radaring. And I'm not sure whether or not those buttons would be even useful in the Star Wars universe as far as... and actually, I mean, obviously, I'm sure they could be programmed for whatever, but anyway. Trying to make that decision as to whether or not you should just kind of imitate the thing that we do here on Earth and then modify a little bit or try to create it from scratch. I think with the starfighters, it's okay to go pretty far in the direction of kind of like mimicking the interior of an actual Earth ship because A, so many of those instruments in the movies are clearly analogs of stuff that we have now. But then on top of that, the things like the, you know, the control sticks and the throttles and the switches and everything, all of that stuff, it's just slightly modified versions of what we have here. And so if it was, you know, I would say just oh, sorry, hold on a second. Again, just go for whatever is A, visually appealing, and then B, kind of indicates what that thing does without you having to actually, without making it feel so much like what we have here. So don't, you know, don't use an exact replica of some kind of radar that we use here, or radar screen. You would want to use the idea of it and then design it in a way where it looks a bit different, but at the same time, I don't think you should shy away too much from using a lot of the little bells and whistles that would be in a real jet fighter, because it still fits in universe when you can see how many aspects of the interiors of the X-Wings and the A-Wings and stuff look just like stuff we have now already. Now, by the way, because this just occurred to me, if you're wondering why I had that strip of white across the bottom of the canvas for such a long time, um, it's because the horizon line is actually below the image. The way that I've set it up to get the, and again, that's kind of part of what I was talking about before, where I sort of imagine the image and then put in the perspective to figure out what I need. I don't think normally I would have thought to put the horizon line below the image, and while I'm not even sure if that's necessarily a good idea, by starting with the thumbnail before doing the perspective, I ended up setting up a perspective situation where the horizon line is below the image. So I've got that little extra bit of white at the bottom just so I can see where the vanishing point is. Or at least not even, well, vanishing point for some of the stuff, but for the most part just the horizon line. So this is the big moment now. You can see where I'm starting to add color to it. And again, I'm just kind of pushing it, usually till I go a little, at least a little bit too far. And then pruning away at it until I start to like it. But I kind of try to get all the ideas out at once. It's not really imperative, but also I think it helps to to not kind of have too many of the lights clustered in one area when they're all on. I mean, it's obviously, as far as instruments go, you're going to have a lot of lights in similar areas, but design-wise, when you're choosing, which lights to turn on and which switches to have flipped and stuff like that, again, I mean, just think about rhythm and how the lights are going to kind of move you around the image. But then on top of that, just in general, I find it helps to kind of, once you've figured out where all the lights are, just turn a bunch of them off. Same with when you're doing a cityscape. Having either in a cityscape's case the windows, or in a cockpit's case the lights on the buttons and the lights on the indicators, to just, instead of having everything turned on in some way that, because it feels unrealistic. Theoretically, these would all be some kind of warning system or relay system to tell you what's going on with the ship, and they probably wouldn't all be on at the same time. And visually, it's boring and it is confusing if you just turn on all the lights and leave them that way. So make sure you turn a bunch of them off. Alright, so here I'm adding lighting just sort of to kind of spice things up a bit and make it more visually interesting. Lighting-wise, I think it's safe to assume there's probably some kind of overhead light above the pilot. But then on top of that, I think it just looks nice if you have a lot of times some kind of light source above the ship, so you get a little bit of a rim light that's touching the canopy and all that stuff. And even still at this point, when I've added in the glow and the color and everything's there, I'm still, actually, especially at this point, because I kind of know what the instruments are, I'm just visually trying to think of what it is that conveys the message that I'm trying to say through these shapes. So, just kind of looking at it, if it feels like there are too many lights, I turn some lights off. If it feels like, some buttons are too big, or they're taking up too much space, or I'm noticing it too much, I'll bring the value down, or do something to make it so they're less noticeable. So at this point now I'm just trying to making things look weathered. Uh, Throwing in some textures. I'll probably paint in a couple of things later, but just trying to make it, give it that Star Wars feel of, again, the lived-in universe, where everything is, or I shouldn't say everything, but nothing looks pristine or like it just came out of a shop. Um, I mean, theoretically, you could have a ship where the narrative goal of it was you wanted to kind of show that it was like the newest, fanciest, most sleek ship. And actually, Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon's ship in The Phantom Menace is kind of like that, or the one Queen Amidala's escort ship, or whatever it's called. That would actually be a good example. I can't think of it exactly off the top of my head, but I doubt the interior of that ship is very dirty. Because again, it's part of the story. The whole theme for that ship is that it's a royalty, so it wouldn't have the scratches and the dirt and the wires everywhere. But for a fighter that's seen a lot of action, I mean that's usually where you want to go. And actually, come to think of it, the ships in the Phantom Menace, in general, don't have as much of that lived-in universe feel. There aren't too many to go. The pod racers do. The pods do. But I can't think of too many. But the Jedi Starfighter and the Queen Amidala's escort ship, both of those are really kind of high-tech looking and have really nice interiors, as far as I remember. So do what you want, I guess. Now I'm kind of sticking in the flight stick at the end, and I think, for now, this will do it. And again, the flight stick is a good example of one where the flight sticks in X-Wings, which are the only one I can think of off the top of my head. Oh wait, no. Maybe I'm not thinking of the X-Wings. I'm not sure, but we're at the end of the video, so it doesn't matter that much. But anyway, the flight sticks in most of the ships that I can think of off the top of my head right now are very similar to, like, what I would consider fairly standard jet fighter flight sticks. Again, with the idea that their purpose and their uses are probably similar enough to where it's worth just having the design kind of mirror more the way we have it here than just throw some frills on it. So hopefully that should give you guys an idea, kind of how I go through the process from beginning to end. Specifically, just coming up with those initial thumbnails, and then everything you have to go through to get to, the fruition of that thumbnail, and kind of taking those strange gray shapes and fleshing them out into ideas and monitors and buttons and lights and colors and stuff. But anyway, yeah, hopefully it helped, and you got something. Have a good one.